We appreciate all of you paying attention to the 415ers podcast, as always, 3 times a week on the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network with 95.7 The Game. Marc Grandy, Evan Giddings. You can follow Marc on social at Marc Grandy, Marc with a C, Grandy with an I. I'm on social at eGiddings10. Marc, it's an interesting time of year because, look, the 49ers are fortunate enough to have wrapped up the division. I think this is the earliest that they have done it since 2011. Of course, that's a benefit. You get a chance to rest up, load manage, get set for the postseason while still having your eyes on maybe the 2, or I guess technically they're not mathematically eliminated from the 1 seed, but I would
Not
expect
yet.
I would expect Philly to grab that eventually. But you also start to look at, all right, who's on the horizon? Like, what kind of postseason matchups could the 49ers be looking at? Now, they could be looking at a potential first round preview this weekend with Washington, and we're going to dig into the Commanders in depth on our Friday preview episode. But, right now they're matched up, I believe, with the Giants. At the bottom, you're also looking at the Detroit Lions starting to creep up, where people are throwing into the conversation of who you don't want to see in the first round of the playoffs. Can't believe I've ever heard that about the Detroit Lions before.
Dan
But
Campbell.
Marc, have you sort of, I don't know, begun to map out a potential, maybe not postseason path at a multiple game level, but who the 49ers could be matching up with in that first week of the playoffs?
100%. I think you have to at this point. I don't know if the team is as much. I think they are less worried at this point, worrying about who they might play. They'd rather just get the 2 seed, guarantee yourself 2 home games if you're able to win that first one, and then whoever you play, you play. But I mean, looking at for me specifically, taking away from the team's perspective, pretty clear that you have 4 options: the Giants, the Commanders, the Seahawks, and the Lions. I think of that group of 4, something that you just mentioned, honestly, I might be most scared of the Detroit Lions. It's strange. I mean, they have the best offense of the group, and it's not particularly close. Jared Goff is quietly and without really much recognition having a fantastic bounce back season. He does not get enough credit. They have a pretty scary offense. They have some dudes at wide receiver. They recently got Jameson Williams back, who was the best receiver in college football a year ago before suffering a really bad knee injury. And that cost him a few spots in the draft in the first, 13 weeks of this year, 14 weeks of this year. He's back. They have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's one of the better, most exciting receivers in the NFL. They have like a trio of running backs that all can beat you. Jamal Williams is leading the league in touchdowns. DeAndre Swift is as explosive as any. So I'm scared of the Lions offense. I do think the Niners will be able to beat any of those 4. But if you're a 49er fan and you had your druthers, I think I'd rather play a team like the Giants or the Commanders over Detroit. I'm not exactly sure how to feel about the Seahawks in a postseason game. That just feels difficult to stomach as a 49er fan because you've been dealt so many blows by the Seahawks over the past. But I'm trying to avoid the Lions. They are, besides the Niners and the Eagles, the hottest team in the NFL. So I'm trying to avoid them. Give me the Giants or the Commanders. Maybe we'll get a little bit of a preview here this week, as you mentioned. But I got a feeling it's going to be the Giants. They picked up that big win Monday night. That is gigantic for their postseason hopes, and maybe it's enough to keep them in that 6th spot. But we'll see.
That's interesting because, well, one, you do know that if the 49ers pull off your prediction and become the 2 seed in the playoffs, they are, at this point, looking like they're going to face the Detroit Lions. Like, that would be your reward.
Yeah. But it's worth it. It's worth it for a second home game, in my opinion. Like, again, I
get to that second home game.
True. I mean, I to be fair, I prefaced it all with saying I think the Niners will be able to beat the Lions, but I think it might be the biggest challenge for them of that group of 4. But to me, more important than thinking for the team's perspective, more important than thinking about who you might play and should we try to lose this game? Should we try to get the 2 seed? Should we avoid this team and as a result, lose this game? You don't think about that. You do what's best for you in your control, which is win as many games as you can, get the 2 seed, guarantee 2 home games again if you win that first one and you deal with who you face. Maybe it would be a little different if, say, the Eagles were this juggernaut and they won their first 6 games of the year and they were undefeated and by far the best team in football. And then Jalen Hurts went down with an injury that cost him 2 months, and they fell to 7-7. And then they get Jalen Hurts back for the stretch run and they win games. And suddenly they sneak into the 7 or the 6 spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then you are playing that. Like, that's different. It's not like the Lions are this juggernaut who's suddenly finding their form because of injuries early in the year. They're not that kind of team. If that scenario, an Eagles injury that bounced them down near the bottom of the pile, if that was in the cards, then maybe you start actually thinking about trying to avoid them. But none of those 4 teams that are possible are worthy of that kind of respect. So the Niners get the 2 seed, deal with who you play. Hopefully you get 2 home games.
No, I'm with you. I think it's funny. Number one, well, I have been on the Lions for a little bit. I do like Detroit.
You
I
predicted
thought
them
they're
to
going to
beat the Bills.
Yeah. I thought they were going to beat the Bills on Thanksgiving. And as much as it pains me to say, I did think they would beat the Vikings, in which they were favored to on the road a couple weeks back. But no. I say all this to say it's just funny how, like, we'll talk about certain postseason teams and, it's kind of their threat level to the Niners, or, their dark horse ability. Did you know that the Detroit Lions as a franchise have won 1 playoff game in their entire existence? I believe it was 1992.
If the Detroit Lions get to the playoffs, and even if they're just competitive, oh my God, the city of Detroit is going to crown Dan Campbell king.
I think he might already be up on the throne. Someone just needs to get him a crown at this point. No, it's it's just funny. I mean, they have that type of postseason history. The New York Giants, meanwhile, have, pretty excellent recent postseason history. We're not going to look at them as a threat, and nor should we. But right now, if we're looking at some of the games, this is just what I would encourage fans to do is, if you can, obviously, if you have the time, I would try to watch some of these teams that the Niners might be facing down the line. Obviously, you want to tune in this Sunday for the 1:00 slate because you want to see Washington. But look,
Saturday.
The Lions are on Saturday, pardon me. Yes. And then, but you're looking at, the Lions and the Panthers could be an interesting matchup. But the one that I got my eyes on, Mark, would be Giants at Vikings. So New York at Minnesota. And that also could potentially be a playoff preview if the Niners in this hypothetical jump Minnesota, and then they would face either Detroit, maybe a Washington, but that could be a first round preview. So there's a lot of kind of interesting, regular season tail end. I'm not sure how coaches are going to play it, if they're going to load manage, if they're going to keep some plays in their back pocket, but there are potential, playoff previews here this weekend on Christmas Eve.
So I think what could be really, really interesting, we talk about
Eagles, Cowboys also.
Yeah, I mean, the Jalen Hurts injury is something that everyone is going to be keeping their eye on. I know if any of our listeners, are into sports betting in the NFL, there was a gigantic swing in that line for the Eagles Cowboys, and it was before the Jalen Hurts news came out. So Vegas was ahead of everyone else in terms of the news, and you knew something was up when Dallas suddenly was a favorite. You're like, what the hell is going on there? And then the news came out, and it was Jalen Hurts. So we'll obviously be keeping an eye on that. Excuse me, but we talk a lot about the Niners and who they might be playing in the first round. The Niners could also maybe make this more difficult on the Minnesota Vikings. Let's pretend for a minute that Minnesota is able to hold off the Niners and Minnesota gets the 2 seed. If you're the Minnesota Vikings, of that same group of 4 that we're talking about with the 49ers, Giants, Washington, Seattle, Detroit. If you're the Vikings, who are you most scared of? I think it's also probably the Detroit Lions. You just mentioned a little bit ago, they played a couple weeks ago. The Lions were favored and they controlled that game and won. If you're the Niners, you want to beat Washington, one, to help your chances of getting that 2 seed. But if that fails and you're unable to get the 2 seed, but you still hand Washington a loss, that helps Detroit potentially sneak up into the 7 spot, and the 7 spot plays the 2. And who knows? Maybe the Lions do the Niners a gigantic solid. They upset the 2 seed, maybe not even much of an upset based on how Vegas looks at it, but they upset the Vikings, and suddenly the Niners, despite the fact that they are the 3 seed, they would still be in line to host 2 playoff games if they win their first one. So it's not only looking at what the Niners might do in terms of who they're trying to play or who they try to avoid, but it's kind of a two-pronged thing, because on the flip side of that, whichever team you're not getting, the Vikings are getting it. And who might the Vikings be most scared of? It's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would. This may come off as strange, but I would be more afraid of Washington. And the reason
Mm,
is because I think they're the more balanced team of the three. Detroit does have a higher powered offense, but to me, that can be maybe not completely taken away, but negated and limited by San Francisco's top tier defense. The one thing Detroit does not have is an ability to stop teams from scoring. They're involved in a lot of shootouts, although they played pretty well against the Jets on the road this past weekend. For me, it's Washington because they have something that the 49ers have not faced, I think, maybe even throughout this season outside of perhaps New Orleans, but that's a dominant front on the defensive side. So a defensive line that is very, very good. Speaking of Pro Bowlers, they could have 3 of their 4 front defensive players in the Pro Bowl. Washington could. And they also have a quarterback that is kind of a dual threat guy. Like I think I honestly think there's a lot of Taylor Heinecke in Brock Purdy or vice versa. Now they're both pretty limited quarterbacks, but they have a
uh,
similar path, shall we say, as guys that were overlooked for reasons that are a little bit different. Brock Purdy, I think there's a lot more tape on him, so there's a lot more to critique out of Iowa State. Taylor Heinecke, I think, was a James Madison, so he was an FCS quarterback. So he gets thrown in kind of the Trey Lance group of, well, you didn't play major Division One football, so he gets overlooked a little bit, but they're both pretty mobile. They both don't have great arms, and they both find weird ways so far to have won. I mean, Taylor Heineke's first real big stage game was, I think, in the 2019 playoffs when he almost beat Tom Brady
yeah.
and the Buccaneers, or 2020, pardon me. But then also, you look at playoff teams and like one thing also I'll keep an eye on is like I expect the 49ers to win against Washington, but something you have to pay attention to is if two teams play a second time in a season and get a chance, and this is why I might be afraid of Seattle a little bit. There is some sort of, I don't know if there's a correlation between losing in the regular season and winning in the postseason, but sometimes you get a better look at your opponent and what they want to do when they dominate you because you know what adjustments to make. The 2 examples that come to my mind recently are, I think, the Chiefs in 2019. This was the 2019 example. They lost to the Titans in the regular season, beat Tennessee in the playoffs to get to the Super Bowl. And also to go back, I think it was in '07, the New England Patriots beat the New York Giants in the regular season before losing in the Super Bowl. So I think look, I'm not saying if the Niners beat Washington on Sunday that means that the Commanders automatically have an advantage if they face in the postseason. But I do think with familiarity between the two and having seen them live, I do think the Niners catch some teams off guard just because of how physical they are from the jump. And if you already have a taste of that, I think it would help in postseason play. That's why I would say Washington.
Interesting. I definitely respect their defense, and especially the front, as you mentioned. Getting Chase Young back as well. That's extremely helpful. They are fearsome up front, but they're. I mean, I have respect for Taylor Heineke. You mentioned kind of his journey. He actually played at Old Dominion, mostly
Oh, pardon me.
his career there, FCS. I think in his last year there, they actually transitioned to the FBS. But as I mean, your point still stands. Overlooked at the college level, not playing, highly ranked college football. And he really only got his shot in that 2020 year because of the roster, expansion for COVID. He was the kind of the emergency quarterback that stayed away from the team for Washington, the Washington football team at the time, because you needed in the age of COVID, if your quarterback room gets COVID, one player gets it, they're likely all going to get it. You need kind of that safety blanket away from the team to come in and help out for a couple of weeks. And that's what happened. He came in and he played well enough, and it was late in the year that they kept with him. And as you mentioned, he ultimately almost beat Tom Brady. So a fantastic story, Taylor Heinecke. But unfortunately, he just does not scare me, and the rest of that offense does not scare me. I think that the Washington defense very well could limit the Niners the most of that group of four. I mean, certainly it's between them and the Giants. The Seahawks and the Lions defense just simply not on the level of those other two. Um, but I just don't think their offense can do anything against this 49er defense. And the Niners have shown if they need to win a game 13 nothing or whatever it was against the Saints, they can do that. And frankly, I'm not so sure that the Commanders are going to put up many points on the Niners, if any at all, if that situation arises. So I kind of agree with you in respecting the defense, but I just don't think they can stick with it offensively enough to really make that game too competitive.